Today's video is me going down every NBA team's X Factor, and I just want to clarify two things. One, normally I would save this video for like right before the playoffs, but honestly, I don't know why I feel like making it now, but I'm just making it now, and X Factors can still contribute to the regular season. It's just more of a playoff thing, typically speaking. And then two, an X Factor to me is pretty much somebody whose performance is generally going to vary from a game-to-game basis, so it tends to be a more inconsistent player or something that, you can't necessarily rely on game in, game out. So that could be a star player who's inconsistent, or it could be a role player, or it could be, it's not even necessarily an individual player, but like a series of players on a team or a certain factor within the team that's wishy-washy. So it can be a variety of things, but basically a factor that they could play really well or they could play really bad. And some players, I kind of expect the same performance every time. Them, you're getting a different player every night. So that's what an X Factor is to me. So I'm going to talk about that with every NBA team. Let's get into it. Before I continue on with this video, about half of the people that watch these videos are not subscribed, so if you've fallen to that 50%, then please subscribe. I am 750 subscribers away from 200K, so if you could help me reach that goal, that would be much appreciated. Also drop a like on this video. It only takes 1 second and makes a massive difference. We're going to start off with the Eastern Conference. For the Chicago Bulls, I am going with Derrick Jones Jr. Derrick is a really solid defensive player and a really solid finisher in the paint, who also this year is shooting 37% from three. Granted, it's on like nothing volume, and they're like all corner threes, all assisted, but it's not nothing. Derrick Jones is like the best wing and larger wing defender on this team. Javonte Green's like 6'4", Alex Caruso and Lonzo Ball are both like 6'4", obviously. Derrick Jones is like 6'10", and he's lengthy, and he's not the strongest in the world, but he's by far and away the Bulls' best chance at defending like a Kevin Durant or a Giannis type of player. And unfortunately, yesterday for the Bulls-Nets game, he got injured in the first 40 seconds, and he's not going to play for the next 6 weeks. But when it comes to playoff time, Derrick Jones, if he's still on this roster and not traded for some other forward, like Jeremy Grant, for example, he's going to be the guy that they go to defensively against the bigger forwards, and hopefully he can do a decent job there. For the Brooklyn Nets, I'm going to have to go with their backcourt of James Harden and Kyrie Irving. It's weird to pair both of those players here, but because they just are, well, Kyrie's not playing a lot, or he hasn't played to this point, but if he is playing and he is healthy, then he's not really someone who I expect to be inconsistent. And then it just comes down to James Harden, because James Harden has been really weird this year. He's been much better as of late. He had a phenomenal game against the Bulls, but in general, you're not sure what version of James Harden you're getting right now, and that's very important. I think generally speaking, Kevin Durant and their role players are pretty consistent outside of like maybe Joe Harris. James Harden is definitely their X factor for sure, and Kyrie kind of, because he doesn't play all that much. For the Miami Heat, I'm just going to kind of go with their entire bench unit, excluding Tyler Hero, the main names there being Max Strus and Gabe Vincent. Both of them have been surprisingly good for the Heat this year, but not always. They're kind of inconsistent themselves, and I don't know how much we can trust these guys who are good NBA players for the first time in their career to be a big part of a playoff rotation. So we'll have to wait and see on that one. For the Milwaukee Bucks, Jrue Holiday. Jrue Holiday has actually been pretty consistent this year. He's having one of the better years of his career. However, in the playoffs, he shot 40% from the field and 30% from three. And especially in the finals, he would either have a garbage performance or a great one. When I went to game 4, he hit 4 threes in like the first quarter. So that was good Jrue Holiday, but you're also privy to bad Jrue Holiday. And Chris Middleton is kind of the same way there. I think Jrue Holiday is just like 5% more inconsistent. For the Philadelphia 76ers, I am going with Danny Green. Do I even need to bother telling you why? Danny Green is like the most inconsistent three-point shooter of all time. So there you go. For the Cleveland Cavaliers, I would go with Rajon Rondo, which is very odd because they just traded for him, but he's kind of filling the Ricky Rubio role that Ricky Rubio was playing flawlessly before I believe he tore his ACL, something season ending. and they traded for Rondo to fill that role. And Rondo's done a pretty solid job since being in Cleveland. But how well he fulfills that role in the long term, how well he fulfills it in the playoffs, that could kind of determine how good this team ends up being offensively. For the Toronto Raptors, Gary Trent Jr. Again, this is just a player who is pretty inconsistent. And now that we're getting to the Hornets, who I believe are currently the 8th seed, I should mention, which I did not mention in the intro, that I'm going to talk about any team that I think really has a chance of making the playoffs, not necessarily teams that are all in the top 8 right now. So there are 3 teams outside of the top 8 right now in the Eastern Conference that I think have a shot at being a playoff team. Meanwhile, there are like none outside of one for the West, so we'll talk about them there. But yeah. For the Charlotte Hornets, PJ Washington specifically at center. PJ Washington, I expect to be all right. He typically is. But the Hornets' offense, especially, their defense is whatever. But their offense, when they are running their lineup with PJ Washington at the 5 spot, is just so good because of how much spacing there is out there. If PJ Washington can effectively play that position, it makes things a lot better for them because it means their offense is more spaced out, and it means they don't have to play Mason Plumlee, who kind of sucks on both ends, but at least he's physically large. But, you know, against teams like the Sixers, there's not a chance in hell you can play him there, but against some other teams that aren't really going to dominate you too much in the paint, there's a world where you're not giving up too much defensively there. And if he's good enough defensively that you're not giving up too much, then that is definitely very helpful. For the Boston Celtics, I could not choose of literally anyone that is not Jaylen Brown or Jason Tatum. Like, that, maybe make their coach the X factor. Like, that entire roster is just kind of a nightmare right now. Al Horford's cool. Robert Williams is cool. Maybe Marcus Smart if I have to pick one individual player. But outside of those two, and those two can be inconsistent themselves, especially Jason. But outside of those two, it's just ugly. And the Celtics are reaching the point where it's like, do we hit the panic button and just accept that this team is never reaching the conference finals heights that it originally had? At least not with some serious adjustment. I don't know, that's a different conversation for another day. For the New York Knicks, Evan Fournier. Again, this is one that is pretty self-explanatory because Evan Fournier has been one of the most inconsistent players in the league, and he's leaned more towards bad. He had a really great, I think he had like 40 against the Celtics the other day, and he's been better in general, but he can be bad a lot sometimes, and the majority of the season has been bad. So if he has a good playoff series, that would make a world of difference, assuming that they did make the playoff. They're in the play-in right now. But yeah, Evan is very inconsistent, so he's an X factor. The next team is the Atlanta Hawks. These two teams actually made a trade today, which you can see my reaction to over on my second channel. But Clint Capella is my pick for the Atlanta Hawks for their biggest X factor. Right now, it's leaning towards Clint might actually end up being traded because he's been so bad this year. But Clint last year was like the anchor of their defense and one of the main reasons why they were not a horrendous defense. This year, they have been a horrendous defense because Clint Capella has not been the same. So if he could turn it around and be the defensive force that he was the year previous, to the point where he was getting Defensive Player of the Year consideration, that would make a world of difference for the Atlanta Hawks. But until that happens, yeah, he's the X factor because we have to wait and see if that happens, basically. We are now getting to the Western Conference. And for the Golden State Warriors, I have a kind of complicated answer, and it is their wings outside of Andrew Wiggins. Those wings being Andre Iguodala, Juan Toscano-Anderson, and Otto Porter Jr. Really seems like on a night-to-night basis, two of these players play okay to bad, and one of them plays really good. And it really just depends on the night. And in terms of who I would expect to play the best, if I had to pick one, it would be Otto Porter Jr. as the best player here. But in terms of the wing production, it would be nice if you just knew what you were getting on a game-to-game basis. As long as one of them steps up every time, it ends up working out. But it's kind of inconsistent what you're getting from each of these guys every night. For the Phoenix Suns, I'm going to go with Jay Crowder, purely for the fact that Jay Crowder either shoots 80% from 3 or 10% from 3, it feels like. Like he either hits 7 or he hits 1 out of 8. That's obviously like the definition of inconsistent, Jay Crowder. For the Utah Jazz, this is what I mean when it's not really an individual player and it can come down to a concept like it did with the Heat for their bench. With the Jazz, I'm just going with their perimeter defense, period. And it's not even really necessarily an X factor because I don't expect it to be good enough. But if they could have a more impactful perimeter defensive postseason than they did last time, that'd make a world of difference for their defense as a whole. Made a whole video on the Utah Jazz and why their defense ends up collapsing in the playoffs, and it is not solely Rudy Gobert's fault, though his limitations are exploitable. The Utah Jazz system sets him up to be exploited, and if their perimeter defense just simply stepped up to the plate, it would make it a lot harder to exploit Rudy Gobert. So if their perimeter defense could step up, one of the names that stands out there would be Royce O'Neal, Donovan Mitchell, who's gradually gotten better there, Mike Conley, what's his name? Australian dude, Joe Ingles. People stepping up in that area would make a world of difference for the Jazz, but I don't know how comfortable I am betting on that happening. For the Memphis Grizzlies, I'm going to go Jaren Jackson Jr., and actually specifically Jaren at center, because as of late, he has been phenomenal at center, and the video that will hopefully come out tomorrow is probably going to be about the Memphis Grizzlies, and he's going to be a big part of that. But a lot of the success of the Grizzlies has also been tied to how well Jaren has played. Like, if Jaren has a bad game, the Grizzlies tend to lose. If he has a good game, they tend to win. So he's like very inconsistent, and how well he plays is very contingent on the Grizzlies' success. In fact, if I was going to say there was one player who solely impacted their team's success the most out of all of these names in this video, it might be him. Because good Jaren Jackson Jr. is like the piece that puts the rest of this roster over the top. And then when he has a shit game, you see the results, generally speaking. It's not a one-to-one guarantee thing that always happens, but it happens a lot. For the Dallas Mavericks, I have to, of course, go with Kristaps Porzingis. Who else would it be other than maybe Tim Hardaway Jr., who's having kind of a down year? But Porzingis, he was really good in the playoffs 2 years ago. He was really, really bad in the playoffs a year ago. So what version are you getting of him this time? We'll see. For the Denver Nuggets, I have to go with Will Barton and Monte Morris, although this kind of comes with a little bit of an asterisk because when/if, because I don't know the exact timetable, Michael Porter Jr. and Jamal Murray come back, I don't know how important these guys are going to end up being. And then at that point, the X factor ends up being how good those guys are after a long time not playing basketball. But Will Barton and Monte Morris have been the guard/wing that have stepped up in the void of those two offensively. Will Barton a little bit more than Monte, which is a little sad because I expected Monte to have a lot better of a season than he has had. But offensively speaking, it's been those two who have really filled the void, been the guys who are shooting threes, playing in the pick and roll with Jokic, cutting, all that kind of stuff within the Nuggets offense. And it's not the same, but they're capable of at least being serviceable in that area when you have a generational playmaking talent like Jokic. And if they have a good performance, that makes a difference. For the Lakers, I just simply put down LOL in all caps. That entire fucking roster is an X factor. So moving on. The Los Angeles Clippers are probably not going to make the playoffs because Paul George is potentially out for the year. And if he's out for the year, Kawhi's not going to come back. And they're looking to potentially be sellers at the deadline. So not talking about them. Same goes for the Portland Trail Blazers because Damian Lillard is out for like 6 weeks and it could potentially extend to even longer than that. And they're already deep in the trenches right now, so they're not going to make the playoffs. So you're wondering why there's not an X factor for either of those two teams. That would be why. And there's actually going to be a second channel video probably tomorrow where I talk about both of those teams and their situations. But yeah, so that's why they're not getting X factors. And then last but not least, the Minnesota Timberwolves, I will go with Malik Beasley. Malik is having a really down year shooting-wise after getting his contract extension, where last year he averaged 20 points per game in his time with the Timberwolves. Or was that the year before? Did that trade go down last year or the year before? I can't even remember anymore. But Malik Beasley, not shooting well. Statistically, historically, a really good three-point shooter. So him actually hitting his shots would make a world of difference. But yeah, that is every NBA team's X factor. at least by my definition of what an X factor is. So yeah, that is it. Goodbye.